And most importantly, he's been involved in a series of government advisory bodies, but most recently, the First Nations Referendum Working Group, which advised the government on the wording of the constitutional amendment, which was hotly negotiated around exactly what the wording would be, how the question would be put, and how the referendum would operate. He's been travelling relentlessly in support of the voice, so we're very grateful to have Noel here. We've got 25 minutes together. I'm going to put some questions to Noel, but we can take questions from the floor here in Sydney, and Lucy's going to relay any questions from Melbourne, from Brisbane, from Adelaide, from Canberra, and from Perth, and wherever else you are joining us online. Noel, what does this referendum mean to First Nations peoples?
There's a missing piece in the Constitution concerning the recognition of the original peoples. It was the case in 1901 when Australia came together. In fact, the Constitution at that time explicitly excluded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the new parliament that was set up did not have power to legislate in relation to Aboriginal people, and it did not count Aboriginal people in the census. And that situation prevailed for 67 years. And it was remedied, it was neutralised in 1967 in a referendum, but it then resulted in a situation where the word Aboriginal did not appear in the Constitution at all. There was no positive recognition. And we've been on a campaign that really stretches back to the 1930s for a voice to the Parliament. And so this latest phase of the last 15 years just builds on a movement of our people that goes back in the early years of the 20th century. We're now literally 6 weeks away from achieving our goal. The Prime Minister has kicked off the campaign yesterday. It's a very important moment for Australians to focus on this referendum and to execute our duty as Australians, which is to vote yes or no to the proposed change. And I'm part of the Yes23 campaign that's going around the countryside, having conversations with as many Australians as possible, with 30,000 volunteers and counting. It's the largest mobilisation of a political campaign in the history of the country. We want thousands more to join us in the coming weeks. This is for Indigenous people, this is absolutely a kind of Halley's Comet moment. If we don't seize it, while it's within reach, I don't see a scenario anytime in the future where we're going to have the same opportunity.
No, we often get asked what practical difference will having a voice make to Indigenous disadvantage?
Well, of course, we're dealing with the Constitution, which is the apex of our democracy, very, very top. We've got to do a lot of things way down the cascade, yeah? The legislation, the policies, the programs, in order to close the gap on disadvantage. We're the most privileged country in the world, possibly. And yet, the parameters of Indigenous disadvantage, we have to go to sub-Saharan Africa to find a life expectancy as low as ours, and educational, health attainment, and incarceration, juveniles, adults in prison, proportionally the highest in the world. And this complex of problems has been with us for many decades now. And it's not shifting. In fact, the numbers are getting worse. And governments have committed. I've seen state and federal governments commit time and time again to the next kind of ambitious policy and campaign on reducing incarceration or reducing children in out-of-home care or reducing children in juvenile detention, and yet the numbers keep getting more and more egregious. So for our people, it's going to be an opportunity to really get policies and laws right. Problem is, we have 95% of the knowledge and 5% of the power. And the governments and decision makers and bureaucrats we deal with are the opposite. They've got 95% of the power and 5% of the knowledge. We're going to need a lot of innovation, a lot of new ideas, rather than the traditional approaches that have failed. How do you solve poverty? Does Australia know how to even do that? Those are the issues that are going to confront us and that confront the country now. We're going to find solutions to poverty, which is not just an Indigenous problem. There's probably 1 million Australians for whom nothing is working. They're migrants, they're poor white Australians, and they're Indigenous people. And so some of the challenges we have are not just restricted to our people. They're structural challenges of poverty and exclusion and intergenerational lack of a proper place in the country, economically and socially and so on. So the voice and our people are going to have to come up with innovative ideas to tackle these long-standing problems. And there's a lot of very exciting things happening around the countryside that show us that there are solutions. One of which, Tim, I'm proud to say, is our year 12 completions in Cape York Peninsula are 93%. People who work with us and we support, that rate is better than the mainstream rate. We put kids into our programs and they go to the best schools in the state, and we get their parents to take responsibility for them, and they contribute financially to their children's education, even though they are on welfare. We're starting to see really amazing things. So we've got solutions. Our problem is that 95% problem. You know, the bureaucrats and the politicians, they got all the power, but they don't have the solutions. And the voice will enable us to really, you know, put our ideas to the fore and our accountability. Yeah, how is anything going to change if the people involved are not accountable for the outcome? Until Aboriginal communities, leaders, families, until we have a stake in the outcomes, I don't think we're going to see the kind of changes we need.
Noel, I heard an interview with David Littleproud, the leader of the National Party, member for Maranoa, who argued that the current system of representation works perfectly well. He knows the breadth of that vast electorate in Western Queensland, and, you know, electing a couple of Indigenous elders from different parts of the electorate wouldn't be representative of the electorate, which seems a slightly odd argument. In some respects, the voice is actually about just giving visibility to problems before we even get to solutions. You tell the story about rheumatic heart disease.
Yeah. Rheumatic heart disease is a big problem in remote communities in particular. You get a fever as a child or a toddler, and then your heart is compromised for life. And there's nothing medically you can do about that other than to manage it very strictly. And so that is why in their teens and in their 20s and 30s, children who have RHD are likely to have a cardiac arrest. And I hear of cases all the time. Every school notice board has these kids posted up there. The kids don't know they've got a sword hanging over their lives. And at some point, they're going to have a heart seizure. We've had a political representative, by the way, who was a champion of same-sex marriage. This guy, really progressive in relation to same-sex marriage, representing Torres Strait and Cape York, and yet for recognition of Indigenous people, he is an ardent opponent. Anyway, we searched his Hansard record to see whether he'd ever mentioned rheumatic heart disease in 26 years of representation, and there was not once. His constituents, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, a large swathe of his constituents suffer, are Indigenous people, and they suffer from this disease, and yet he has made no representation whatsoever to the federal parliament. He made his first one the week after I talked about this. That is why the voice is needed. You cannot expect our members of parliament. The democracy is a competitive place. You want a law passed, you want a policy change, it's a competitive place. And invariably, Indigenous issues are way down the pecking order of priority. Just to get laws passed, you've got to get in line. Unless there's agitation and unless there are representations being made to the system, Indigenous people are the last in line. David Littleproud is assiduous and energetic on behalf of his main constituency, the National Party. He is not assiduous or energetic about our issues, which is why what he is saying is just nonsense. Just on that, my whole strategy from the very beginning was that Nixon had to go to China. Yeah? And get the Conservatives on board first. Presumably everybody to the left of the Conservatives should fall into line. That's the Nixon to China rule. And so we pursued very energetically common ground with the Conservatives. Well, you know, if you take the political clock on the right-hand side, we wanted to nail our colours at around about 4 o'clock. And then presumably everybody to the left of that should be an easier argument. And we ran that strategy. It worked because the first person to propose constitutional recognition was the Conservative Prime Minister, John Howard. People forget that. John Howard started this. He's now an ardent opponent. He started it. And we worked very hard to maintain common ground with Liberal and National Party leaders. Littleproud's party room is actually filled with people who pledged support for the voice. I can point to any number of National Party politicians who were in support of the voice, and Liberals who were in support of the voice, who are now locked into party positions opposing it. So bipartisanship was only lost when Littleproud, to save his own miserable political high, decided to go no. And he did that in November last year. And of course, Peter Dutton did the same thing earlier this year. And I can tell you, but I don't have the time to do it, I can tell you all the details as to why. It had nothing to do with the voice. It had everything to do with internal machinations within their parties. You know, Dutton has to deal with a very hard right party room. The Liberal Party have gone mad. You know, they have gone really, they're not the Liberal Party of my ken. And the National Party, similarly, who were more sympathetic to the voice than the Liberals, the National Party, there was a defensive move by Littleproud and his supporters to prevent Barnaby Joyce using the voice against his leadership. So Littleproud went hard against the voice simply to protect his arms attacked by Barnaby. That's why we're in this challenging situation of not having bipartisan support. We only lost it in this last less than a year, really since November. Prior to that, we had maintained 15 years of consistent Liberal and National Party support. We had it. 5 governments, all of whom, Labor and Liberal, went to elections since 2007 committed to constitutional recognition. And nevertheless, we can still win without their official support. A lot of members from the Liberal Party joining our Yes campaign. Julian Lisa, possibly the most important constitutional lawyer on the Liberal side. He has obviously resigned his position and is with the Yes23 campaign. We count as very important the number of Liberals that have joined Yes23. And, and we believe there's a pathway to success, notwithstanding the lack of bipartisanship.
Just encourage any questions online. Lucy will shout them out and I'll take questions in the room. Lucy, do you have any questions for us?
I do. Noel, how do you combat misinformation from the No campaign, given fear-mongering seems to be really focused now and having sways with the electorate?
That is difficult because we don't know in this modern era the extent to which this bile from social media, how much, how determinative it will be with the Australian voters. We can only have positive conversations, real conversations, lift ourselves out of the crevices of social media and have real conversations with people. Real democratic conversations, rather than bile versus bile in the lower reaches of the internet. That's all we can put our faith in. We've got to spread a message of hope and possibility and optimism about what we're doing and straightforwardness about what we're doing. Who could, as an Australian, object to the idea that we adopt a 92-word clause to the Constitution approved by 2 former Chief Justices of the High Court as safe, as constitutionally safe? Who could object to a set of words that says, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia? And all of this ruction in on the part of the No campaign is just so unnecessary, so backward moving. How could you defend a status quo maintenance situation? How could you? The situation with Indigenous people is a travesty, and it will continue. We don't come to grips with the importance of recognising the original peoples of the country. Remember, think about this harbour here when the ships arrived. And this was proposed as a potential compromise. Who back then would have said no? It's extremely modest, but it is profound, and it is late in the day. A lot of disastrous history has occurred since then, and yet this is what is proposed as a way to settle all of the things that were the consequence of a bunch of ships turning up here and taking the country without consent. And the Indigenous people are proposing this as a means of settlement. And how could we be truculent about that? So we have our opportunity. I believe the Australian people are ready for this. John Howard believed the Australian people were ready for this. That is why he proposed recognition in 2007. And the recognition is in the form of a voice outside of the parliament to the parliament. It doesn't change our democracy fundamentally in terms of lawmaking. The parliament remains the lawmaker, and no advice or representation made to it is binding upon it. Parliament still has its supreme power to make laws. What this does is set up a voice outside of the parliament whenever laws and policies are proposed about our people. These are the words: on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. That's what the representations and advice is about. It's not nuclear submarines. It's not parking tickets. It's not, as Credlin said, if there was another Lent siege and the gunman might have been Indigenous, we'd have to ring up the voice. And yet these are the kind of scenarios that are painted by the No in order to frighten the Australian people.
No, take a breath. Noel's been travelling relentlessly and doing 8 of these type of events a day, so we're very grateful. Noel, can I ask you this? How will Australia change with the yes vote and the voice established?
You know, I keep saying that the formal thing we're voting on is the democracy. We're voting on our constitution. And that is about the constitution recognising us. That's what we're doing formally on October the 14th. Will the Australian people amend the constitution to recognise us? That's our formal duty as citizens, and that's what we'll do on October the 14th. The informal thing we're doing at the same time is recognising youth. We're recognising who the Australian people are. Once we recognise Indigenous people, we can't help but see the whole. We're a missing piece of the whole. And when we remedy that, we will see Australia in its totality. And it's been my argument that Australia in its totality is the Indigenous story, going back 65,000 years. It is the British democracy captured in the Constitution, and it is our multicultural unity, which is an amazing thing we've achieved in the world. It is those 3 stories that will come together when we do recognition. And that recognition kind of runs the other way. It's Indigenous people recognising the story of British colonisation and the democracy that is now ours. It's also recognising our great multicultural achievement. I think for the first time we'll have a real sense of who Australians are, who we are as Australians. And I think it's going to be an important moment for all of us to have a full understanding of those 3 Australian stories and how they intertwine. We're going to enter a new era. The country's going to enter a new era. And it's going to be an era where everybody has an understanding about where Indigenous culture, what role Indigenous culture and heritage plays in the identity of Australia. So I think, Tim, that is what is going to change after this referendum. We're going to have a sense of identity that is whole and inclusive of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage.
Noel, on that message of hope and a better Australia, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Final word from
For me, Dentsu's been very strongly behind the Yes23 vote. You've heard about us on this topic a number of times. Can I ask each of you, whether you're online or you're in this room in Sydney, when you go back to your desk, log on to the Yes23 website, have a look at how you can volunteer, download some campaign materials, and please consider making a donation because it's a 6-week sprint. It's now or never. Thank you very much for attending.